If you were a woman living 8,000 years ago in a small farming village, you weren't having one child or two or three. You were having eight, maybe 10. That is not an exaggeration. That is the actual number researchers found when they studied Neolithic skeletons and calculated the math. And once you understand why that number had to be so high, you start to understand just how brutal and honestly how remarkable early childbirth really was. Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, humans did something enormous. They stopped wandering and chasing animals and started planting crops. This was the agricultural revolution. But here is something most people don't realize. Farming did not make life easier. In many ways, it made life harder. Diets got worse. Disease spread more easily. Physical labor increased. But there was one thing farming absolutely required in order to work, and that was more people. More hands to plant. More hands to harvest. More people to defend the village. Farming was a numbers game, and the only way to win that game was to have more children than you lost. This is where the research gets interesting. A group of scientists working on what is called the Birth Project spent years studying Neolithic skeletons, specifically women's pelvises, because pregnancy and childbirth actually leave physical marks on bone that never fully disappear. Every pregnancy slightly changes the shape of the pelvis. Every birth leaves behind a small signature. By studying enough skeletons, researchers were able to estimate how many times a woman had given birth across her lifetime. The average came out to 8 to 10 children. This wasn't a vague assumption that families were bigger back then. This was an actual number confirmed through bone analysis. For comparison, the average woman today in most developed countries has fewer than 2 children. Neolithic women were having roughly 5 times that number. Now here is the difficult part. This number was not really a choice. It was survival math. Child mortality in prehistoric times was catastrophic. Some estimates suggest that around 1 in 3 children did not survive to adulthood, and infant mortality alone was often even higher. So if a village needed its population to grow, and not just survive but actually expand, a woman having 2 children was simply not enough. If she had 2 and 1 died, the population would shrink. A woman needed to have 8 to 10 children just to reasonably guarantee that 3 or 4 would survive long enough to have children of their own. This is also part of why older women, grandmothers in particular, played such a critical role in early human groups, because raising that many children was never something one woman could manage alone. It required the support of the entire community. So if women were giving birth this frequently, what did that process actually look like? The first thing worth understanding is that humans are strange compared to almost every other primate species. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans almost always give birth alone. They isolate themselves, find a private space, and go through labor without assistance. Humans do not do this. Humans ask for help. Researchers refer to this pattern as obligate midwifery, meaning human childbirth essentially requires assistance, and this has likely been true for hundreds of thousands of years. The reason for this comes down to just how uniquely dangerous human birth is compared to other species. For a long time, the leading explanation for this danger was something called the obstetrical dilemma. The idea, first proposed in the 1960s, was that walking upright narrowed the human pelvis at the exact same time that tool use and intelligence demanded larger brains, forcing babies to be born earlier and less developed just to fit through the birth canal. This became the standard explanation for decades. However, more recent research has started to challenge this theory. Some scientists now argue that the difficulty of human birth may have less to do with upright walking itself and more to do with how the pelvic floor supports the rest of the body, along with other pressures that are still being studied and debated. What researchers do agree on is this: human babies must physically rotate as they are being born. The head turns one way, the shoulders turn another, simply to pass through the birth canal. No other primate infant has to go through this kind of movement during birth. This rotation is a major reason human labor takes so long, and why having someone present to physically guide and support the mother was not a luxury. It was often the difference between survival and death for both mother and child.
Once the baby was born, the process did not end there. In most early human societies, birth was not a private event. It was communal. Other women in the group, especially older women who had already given birth multiple times, formed a support system around the mother, functioning as an early version of a birthing team. Warmth was critical immediately after birth. Newborns lose body heat extremely fast, and in colder climates during the last ice age, keeping a baby warm through the first night could be the single biggest factor determining whether that child survived at all. Some archaeological sites even suggest the existence of dedicated birthing areas, sheltered spaces set apart from the main living area, likely chosen specifically because they were easier to heat and control. There is one piece of evidence that most content on this topic completely overlooks, and it might be the most powerful example we have. At a site in Austria called Kremswachtberg, archaeologists uncovered a burial dating back roughly 31,000 years, containing the remains of 2 infants. DNA testing later confirmed something extraordinary. These were identical twins, making them the oldest identical twins ever discovered in the archaeological record. One infant appears to have died at or near the moment of birth. The other lived for approximately 6 to 7 weeks. These children were not simply discarded. They were placed carefully into a burial pit, sprinkled with red ochre, a pigment used symbolically in burials across many ancient cultures, and surrounded by more than 30 carved ivory beads. Their bodies were then covered with a mammoth's shoulder blade, which was propped up using a piece of mammoth tusk. A third infant buried nearby at the same site was found with an ivory pin that likely once fastened a fur wrap around the body, essentially functioning as prehistoric clothing, even in death. This tells us something significant. Even 31,000 years ago, in the middle of the Ice Age, during a time when survival was brutal and child death was common, these infants were mourned deeply enough to be given a full and deliberate ceremonial burial. This brings us back to that number from earlier, 8 to 10 children per woman. Once you understand how dangerous birth truly was, how much death surrounded infancy, and how emotionally significant even a single infant's burial could be, that number takes on a completely different weight. Every one of those 8 to 10 pregnancies carried real risk for the mother. Every child that was lost was mourned, sometimes through elaborate ritual, as shown by burials like the one at Kremswachtberg. And yet the survival of the entire group depended on women repeating that cycle again and again. So the next time you think about the agricultural revolution, about farming, villages, and the beginning of civilization as we understand it, remember that it was not built by tools or crops alone. It was built inside the bodies of women who gave birth far more often than most people do today, under conditions that are difficult to fully imagine, surrounded by communities that understood exactly how much every single birth truly cost.